Open a kitchen drawer right now. Anyone. I'll wait. If you found something you forgot you owned, you already know exactly why this video exists. Every single thing sitting in a kitchen is quietly charging rent. Counter space, cleaning time, a small tax on your attention every time your eyes pass over it, whether you're using it or not. Most Western kitchens are full of things paying that rent for years without ever once being used. Here's the honest version of what usually happens. Something gets bought with a real specific intention. The bread maker for weekend baking, the stand mixer for a hobby that was genuinely about to start, the second knife set because the first one felt inadequate somehow. The intention fades, quietly, the way intentions do. What doesn't fade is the object, which stays exactly where it was put indefinitely, long after the reason for buying it has been forgotten. Japanese kitchens run on a different rule entirely. Nothing gets to stay just because it might be useful someday. It has to actually earn its spot every day, or it goes. This isn't about owning less for its own sake, and it isn't about a kitchen so bare it feels unfinished. It's about a much simpler filter than most Western kitchens ever apply. Does this get used regularly by the people actually cooking here? Or is it just present, technically owned, quietly costing space in exchange for almost nothing in return? 15 things Japanese kitchens never have. Number 1 is the one most people don't even realize is the actual problem. Everything else on this list is just a symptom of it. Let's go. 15. The drawer that won't fully close. Every kitchen has one. Old batteries, rubber bands, a takeout menu for a restaurant that closed years ago, a coupon that expired before it was ever used. You shove one more thing in and wrestle the drawer shut. Japanese kitchens don't have this drawer, and it isn't because Japanese households are more disciplined. It's because every drawer has exactly one job. Utensils go in the utensil drawer. Towels go in the towel drawer. Something without an obvious home doesn't get a drawer of its own by default. It gets a decision. That drawer isn't really storage. It's a place where decisions go to be avoided. Every item sitting in it is something that was never actually decided about. Kept, not because it's needed, but because throwing it away felt like it required more thought than shoving it in the drawer did. Getting rid of the junk drawer doesn't mean throwing away everything in it blind. It means going through it once, properly, and discovering that almost none of it earns a second chance. Most of what ends up in this drawer shares one trait. It was never actually being used for its stated purpose. The rubber bands aren't holding anything together. The old batteries haven't been tested in years and probably don't work. The takeout menu is for a place that's been closed since before the pandemic. None of it is doing a job. It's just occupying a space that could otherwise hold something that does. There's a reason this particular drawer resists cleaning out longer than almost anything else in the kitchen. Nothing in it is individually worth the decision. A batter that might still work isn't worth the 2 minutes it takes to test and discard. A coupon that might still be valid isn't worth checking against an expiration date. Each item alone is too small a decision to bother making, which is exactly how dozens of them end up accumulating together, never quite crossing the threshold of being worth the effort to sort. 14. The spice rack with 40 jars. Most Western kitchens have some version of this, a rotating rack or a whole cabinet shelf lined with jars. Cumin. Fennel seed, something called poultry seasoning nobody remembers buying. In practice, most households reach for the same 4 or 5 jars for almost everything they cook, while the other 35 sit there slowly losing whatever flavor they once had. Japanese kitchens tend to keep a small, tight rotation, often stored in a single drawer, not a rack that has to be looked at every time you walk into the room. What's there gets used regularly, which means it actually tastes like something when it's reached for. Spices don't stay potent forever, no matter how good they were the day they were bought. A jar that's been sitting untouched for a couple of years isn't seasoning anymore. It's flavored dust with a label still claiming otherwise. The 40-jar rack doesn't make anyone a better cook. It just makes the kitchen look like the cook someone hoped to become, rather than the one actually standing there most nights. There's a specific reason a smaller, well-used spice rotation tends to produce better food than a large, mostly untouched one. Freshness does more for flavor than variety does. 5 spices bought recently and used often will outperform 40 spices where most have been sitting since a single recipe attempt years ago. The rack isn't the problem. The staleness hiding inside it is. There's also a cost most people don't think to count: the rack itself. A rotating spice tower or a wall-mounted display takes up real counter or wall space permanently in exchange for holding mostly things that aren't being used. A single drawer, sized for the handful of spices actually in rotation, gives that space back for something that earns it. 13. The 15-piece knife block. The knife block shows up in almost every Western kitchen. A big wooden block, a dozen or more slots, each one holding a blade for some specific, rarely needed purpose. A boning knife, a fillet knife, a tomato knife that does exactly what the chef's knife already does, slightly worse. Japanese kitchens tend to run on 3 knives, sometimes 4. One chef's knife for almost everything. A small utility blade and something serrated for bread. That's the whole kit for most home cooks, and it's often the whole kit for professionals too. The real issue usually isn't a shortage of knives. It's that the 2 knives actually being used are dull, while a dozen others sit in their slots doing nothing but taking up counter space and occasionally scaring someone reaching past them for the one that's actually sharp. One well-kept, genuinely sharp knife will outperform an entire block of dull, half-used ones every single time. Mastery of one blade beats ownership of 12. A sharp knife is also, somewhat counterintuitively, the safer option. Dull blades require more pressure to cut through anything, which means more force behind a hand that's more likely to slip. A well-maintained chef's knife, kept sharp and used confidently, does the job faster and with less risk than a drawer full of specialty blades nobody quite remembers how to use properly. Most of the knives in a large block exist for situations that come up rarely, if ever, in an ordinary home kitchen: boning a whole fish, breaking down a large cut of meat, tasks that most home cooks either don't do or don't do often enough to justify a dedicated blade sitting unused between attempts. A chef's knife, in practiced hands, handles the overwhelming majority of what actually happens on a cutting board. 12 novelty mugs and glasses. Nobody drinks from somewhere in most kitchen cabinets. There's a shelf of mugs and glasses that never actually get used. The souvenir mug from a trip years ago, the oversized novelty glass from a gift exchange, the commemorative cup from an event nobody quite remembers attending. These get kept because throwing away a mug feels oddly more wasteful than throwing away almost anything else in the kitchen. It's still perfectly functional after all. But still functional and actually used are different tests, and most of what's on that shelf fails the second one completely. Japanese kitchens tend to keep a small, consistent set of cups and glasses in regular rotation, enough for the household, plus a little for guests, and nothing beyond that sitting in reserve for occasions that rarely come. A cabinet with 6 mugs that all get used regularly serves a kitchen better than one with 25, only 4 of which are ever actually reached for. There's a simple test worth applying to this shelf. Pick up each mug and ask honestly when it was last used, not when it might theoretically be used again. Most of what's collected here fails that test the moment it's actually asked. Keeping something purely because discarding it feels wasteful, while it sits completely unused for years, is its own quieter form of waste, of the cabinet space it occupies and the small decision fatigue of seeing it every time the cabinet opens. Guests are the usual justification for keeping the excess. What if people come over and we need more cups? Returse. In practice, most gatherings large enough to need 20 mugs at once are rare enough that buying paper cups for the occasion or simply not needing every single guest to have a matching ceramic mug, is a perfectly reasonable trade for cabinet space used every single day instead of twice a year. 11. The stand mixer used twice a year. Stand mixers are heavy, expensive, and enormous. 2 feet of counter space or an entire cabinet shelf when it's put away. It got bought during a genuine burst of enthusiasm about baking. It got used for one batch of holiday cookies. Now it sits there, technically available, mostly just visible. Japanese kitchens tend to favor a compact hand mixer instead, something that fits in a drawer, gets pulled out for the handful of times a year it's actually needed, and doesn't ask for a permanent seat on the counter in exchange for occasional use. There is a particular kind of quiet guilt that comes from a large, expensive appliance sitting in plain view, mostly unused. It's not doing its job, it's just there, a reminder of an intention that didn't quite become a habit. If baking twice a year is genuinely the pattern, a hand mixer does the same job in a fraction of the space, and it doesn't spend the other 363 days making anyone feel behind on a hobby they never fully took up. It's worth being honest about what these purchases are usually responding to. A stand mixer rarely gets bought because a hand mixer genuinely can't do the job. For the volume of baking most households actually do, it can. It gets bought because it represents a version of home life that looked appealing in the moment. Someone who bakes often, who has the counter space for it, who uses the mixer weekly instead of biannually. The appliance itself isn't the problem. The gap between what it was bought for and what it's actually used for is 10. The full coffee station, drip machine, French press, pod machine, pour-over kit, sometimes an espresso machine on top of all of it. Many kitchens have accumulated an entire coffee counter over the years, each device from a different phase of coffee enthusiasm that never quite got followed all the way through. Japanese coffee culture tends toward the opposite. Pick one method, get genuinely good at it, and let that be the whole setup. A single ceramic pour-over and a kettle, used consistently and with real attention to timing and temperature, often produces better coffee than an expensive machine that's never been properly maintained. More devices don't produce better coffee. Practice with one does. A coffee corner with 4 different machines usually isn't evidence of expertise. It's evidence of 4 different attempts to find the right one, none of which were given enough time to actually become a habit. One method, done well and consistently, beats a shelf of half-used equipment every time. There's a particular irony in how a full coffee station usually comes together. Each device was bought in pursuit of better coffee, and the accumulation of all of them tends to produce worse coffee than a single method given real attention. Splitting practice across 4 different brewing styles means none of them ever gets mastered. The espresso machine never gets properly dialed in. The French press never gets timed quite right. A single pour-over, made the same way every morning for a year, tends to end up better than any of them individually ever did. There's a maintenance cost hiding in a multi-device coffee station too, one that's easy to underestimate. An espresso machine needs regular descaling to keep working properly. A French press needs its mesh cleaned thoroughly or the coffee turns gritty. A pod machine needs its lines flushed periodically. 4 devices means 4 separate maintenance routines, and in practice, most of them get skipped entirely, which means most of that equipment is quietly producing worse coffee than it's capable of on top of everything else. 9. Single-purpose machines for occasional food. The bread maker, the ice cream machine, the waffle iron. Each one arrived with a genuine specific excitement. Homemade bread sounded wonderful, and for the first 2 or 3 loaves it was. Then the novelty faded, and the machine moved from the counter to a cabinet, and eventually to the back of a closet or the garage, technically still owned, functionally retired. Japanese kitchens apply a simple filter to appliances like this. If it only does one thing, and that thing doesn't happen weekly, it doesn't earn a permanent place in the kitchen. There is no shame in this way of thinking about buying good bread from a bakery instead of making it. The outcome on the table is the same, minus the machine taking up a cabinet shelf for a hobby that turned out to be a phase. A lot of these purchases aren't really about the food at all. They're about buying an identity, someone who makes fresh bread, someone who makes homemade ice cream, that the actual daily habits of the household were never quite going to support. The machine ends up costing real money and real space for an identity that never fully arrived. This is worth separating from genuine, ongoing hobbies, which are a completely different situation. Someone who bakes bread weekly and loves the process has a bread maker that's earning its space many times over. The distinction isn't about the appliance itself. It's about whether the activity it enables actually happened more than a handful of times before quietly stopping. Most of these machines know the answer already, sitting exactly where they were left after the third or fourth use. 8. Open shelving full of things that never get used. Open shelving photographs beautifully. Clean lines, a curated collection of dishware and jars, exactly the kind of kitchen that shows up in design magazines. In daily use, it's a different story. Everything on an open shelf collects dust and kitchen grease, and every item on display becomes one more thing that has to be individually wiped down on a regular basis. Japanese kitchens tend to favor closed storage instead, cabinets and drawers that keep everything out of sight until it's actually needed, and keep dust and grease off things that aren't in regular rotation. There's also a quieter cost to open shelving that's easy to miss. It tends to fill up with decorative rather than functional items. The pretty jar nothing ever goes in, the vintage mug that's for looking at rather than drinking from. Open shelving doesn't make a kitchen feel bigger. It just makes the clutter easier to see and harder to ignore. If it's on display, someone has to keep it looking good indefinitely. A closed cabinet asks for a lot less. There's a specific reason open shelving looks so effortless in photographs and so demanding in daily life. A photograph captures one perfect moment, styled deliberately for the camera. A kitchen has to look that way every single day, on its own, without anyone rearranging it before each glance. Closed cabinets don't need to perform. They just need to close. There's also a slower, less visible cost that open shelving adds. Grease from cooking travels further than most people expect, settling as a thin film on anything left exposed nearby. A jar or plate on a closed cabinet shelf stays clean for months without attention. The same item on an open shelf near a stove needs regular washing just to stay usable, not because it's being used more, but simply because it's been left out in the open the whole time. 7. The garbage disposal. Scraping food waste into the sink and grinding it away feels like the convenient option. No separate bin, no thinking about it. Gone in a few seconds with the flip of a switch. Most Japanese kitchens don't have this option at all. Food waste gets separated deliberately, composted where possible, or, just as often, avoided in the first place through more careful portioning at the point of cooking, rather than dealt with after the fact. There is something worth noticing in that difference. A disposal makes food waste invisible the moment it happens. Down the drain, gone, no evidence left behind to prompt any second thoughts about portion sizes or planning. Without one, waste has to be seen, however briefly, before it's dealt with, and being forced to notice it tends to change how much of it there is to notice in the first place. An invisible problem is very hard to fix on purpose. A visible one, even a small and unglamorous one, usually gets addressed eventually simply because it can't be ignored. This isn't really an argument against convenience for its own sake. It's a specific observation about what happens when a habit's consequences disappear from view entirely. Portioning a meal carefully takes a little more attention up front. Scraping the extra into a disposal takes none. Given the easier option, most households will quietly take it indefinitely, without ever quite registering how much is actually being thrown away in the process. 6. The enormous side-by-side refrigerator. Double doors, an ice maker, a water dispenser built into the front, enough interior space to stock groceries for a month at a time. Many Western kitchens are built around a refrigerator this size as a matter of course. Japanese refrigerators tend to run considerably smaller, and that size difference isn't just about available kitchen space. A smaller fridge simply can't hold a month's worth of groceries, which means shopping happens more often in smaller amounts for food that gets used while it's still fresh rather than forgotten in the back of a shelf. A large refrigerator doesn't just store more food. It quietly gives permission to buy more than will actually get eaten because there's always room for one more thing. And the vegetable drawer 3 weeks deep in something no longer recognizable is the eventual, entirely predictable result. The fridge was never really extra convenience. It was extra room to lose track of things. There is a useful way to test this in any kitchen. Open the refrigerator right now and count how many items are past the point where anyone can confidently say what they still are. A larger fridge doesn't cause this on its own, but it makes it easy to keep buying before anything old has actually been dealt with, which is exactly the condition this kind of forgotten food thrives in. A smaller fridge forces a decision sooner, simply because there's nowhere left to hide the evidence. Grocery shopping habits tend to reshape themselves around whatever fridge is available, more than most people realize. A large fridge invites monthly stock-up trips, buying in bulk for a future that hasn't arrived yet. A smaller one tends to encourage shopping every few days instead for what's actually going to be cooked in the immediate future, a rhythm that, once established, most people find they don't miss the large fridge for it all. 5. The pantry stocked like a bunker walk-in pantries, or even just a deep, fully packed cabinet, have become a fixture of a lot of Western kitchens. Shelves of canned goods, boxed pasta, snacks, and backup snacks for the backups. Much of it purchased with a genuine, if vague, sense of preparedness. Japanese kitchens tend to keep a much smaller reserve, often just a single cabinet holding a week or two of staples at most, with fresh ingredients bought regularly to fill in the rest. There's very little just-in-case stockpiling built into the system at all. A deep pantry has a specific way of quietly working against itself. The sheer volume of options makes it harder, not easier, to decide what to cook, and a lot of what's stored ends up forgotten behind whatever was bought more recently. Dinner still ends up being takeout despite 3 shelves of technically available food. A pantry this full isn't preparation. It's a decision being avoided, one unopened can at a time. Genuine emergency preparedness is a real and reasonable thing to plan for, and this isn't an argument against keeping some staples on hand. The distinction is between a deliberate, maintained reserve and a shelf that simply keeps growing because nothing ever gets removed from it. One is planning, the other is accumulation that happens to be stored in the kitchen instead of somewhere more honestly labeled. A useful way to tell the difference: a genuine reserve gets rotated. Older items used first, replaced as they're consumed, kept at a roughly consistent size over time. A shelf that's just accumulating only ever grows because new items keep arriving while the old ones sit, forgotten behind them, never quite making it back to the front where they'd actually get used before expiring. 4. Automatic dependence on the dishwasher. A dishwasher feels like an obvious convenience. Load it throughout the day, run it at night, and the dishes are handled without much thought. In practice, a lot of households run it half full because a handful of dishes accumulated and someone got tired of waiting for a full load, which erases a fair amount of the efficiency it was supposed to provide in the first place. A meaningful share of Japanese households skip the dishwasher entirely, washing up by hand shortly after eating instead. It takes a few minutes, and it means the kitchen never has a backlog waiting to be dealt with later. There's a specific trap built into "I'll load the dishwasher later." Later has a way of becoming tomorrow, and tomorrow has a way of becoming a late, resentful session, catching up on 2 days of dishes at once. Washing a handful of plates right after a meal, by hand, in a few focused minutes, avoids that pile-up entirely. A dishwasher doesn't necessarily save time. Very often, it just moves the time to a worse moment. This isn't a case against dishwashers existing at all. A genuinely full load, run promptly, is efficient by almost any measure. The issue is the habit that tends to grow up around having one, the assumption that dishes can always wait, because there's a machine for that eventually. A sink that's dealt with immediately, by hand or by machine, simply never gets the chance to become the multi-day backlog that a later mentality reliably produces. There's also a difference in how the two approaches treat a meal's ending. Hand washing right after eating turns cleanup into part of the meal itself, a short, contained task that closes out dinner before moving on to whatever's next. A dishwasher, run whenever it's convenient, disconnects that ending entirely, and the kitchen stays in a state of not quite finished until someone eventually gets around to it. 3. Permanently crowded countertops. Toaster, coffee maker, knife block, a jar of utensils, a fruit bowl, sometimes a stand mixer too. Many kitchens have a counter that's permanently occupied, leaving only a narrow strip of actual usable workspace for the cooking that's supposed to happen there. Japanese kitchens tend to treat the counter as workspace first, storage a distant second. Appliances get put away after use, rather than living out permanently. And what's left is a clear surface, ready to be used the moment it's needed. A crowded counter adds a small tax to every single thing cooked on it. The toaster has to be moved before there's room to chop. The coffee maker has to be nudged aside to make space for a cutting board. None of it is difficult on its own. All of it adds up to friction that shows up every single day before cooking has even started. Clear counters don't just look calmer. They're genuinely faster to cook on because nothing has to be relocated before the actual work can begin. There's a compounding effect worth noticing here, too. A cluttered counter doesn't just slow down the person cooking, it makes the kitchen harder to clean afterward, since every appliance sitting out has to be wiped around rather than simply left in a closed cabinet, while the counter gets a single clean pass. The clutter isn't just costing time at the start of cooking, it's costing time at the end of it as well. It's worth noticing, too, how quickly a cleared counter tends to refill on its own given the smallest opportunity. An appliance used once gets left out for next time. A cutting board stays out because it'll probably be needed again tomorrow anyway. None of these individual decisions feel significant. Together, over a few weeks, they quietly rebuild exactly the crowded counter that was just cleared. Which is why treating a clear counter as the default rather than a one-time cleanup matters more than the cleanup itself. 2. The air fryer used 4 times. Deep fryers, and more recently air fryers, have become a fixture of a lot of kitchens, bought after being hyped everywhere, used enthusiastically for the first few weeks, and then quietly retired to a cabinet once the novelty wore off. Home frying happens far less often in most Japanese kitchens, and when it does, it's usually done simply. A small pot, a couple of cups of oil, vegetables fried in batches for something like tempura, finished in well under half an hour with no dedicated machine required at all. Heavier deep frying tends to be left to restaurants, which are simply better equipped and more practiced at doing it well. An appliance that only fries things doesn't earn much of a place in a kitchen that fries food a few times a year at most. What it mostly does is take up cabinet space in exchange for the memory of a few weeks of genuine enthusiasm. The fix here usually isn't a better appliance. It's better technique with the pan already in the kitchen, and accepting that some foods are simply better left to the restaurants that specialize in them. There is also a practical trade being missed in most fryer purchases. A dedicated frying appliance solves exactly one narrow problem, while taking up space that could otherwise hold something used far more often. A single good pan already in most kitchens can fry, sauté, sear, and simmer. One object doing the job that an entire specialty appliance was bought to handle only once in a while. Cleanup plays a bigger role in this than most people admit up front. A deep fryer or air fryer basket coated in cooled oil residue is one of the more tedious things to clean in an entire kitchen, and that tedium tends to be exactly what pushes the frying frequency down further after the first few uses. A pan with a couple of cups of oil wiped and strained after use is a fraction of the cleanup, which is part of why it actually gets used session after session in a way the dedicated machine rarely does past its first month. 1. The oversized kitchen layout itself. Everything on this list in the end comes back to this one. Large islands, wide gaps between the refrigerator and the stove, kitchens built around the idea that bigger automatically means better. It looks impressive in photographs. In daily use, it usually means walking considerably more just to make a simple meal. Japanese kitchens are typically built around a tight, deliberate triangle. Refrigerator, stove, and sink positioned within easy reach of each other so that cooking happens with a pivot and a step rather than a walk across the room and back, several times over, for a single dish. A larger kitchen doesn't just ask for more steps. It asks for more cleaning, more surface area to keep clear, and more distance between every single tool and the moment it's actually needed. None of that makes the cooking better. It just makes the kitchen bigger. Professional kitchens, including some of the most respected ones in the world, are very often small, tight, efficient spaces where nothing is more than an arm's length away. Size was never really the advantage it was sold as. Layout was always the actual point. It's worth trying this as an experiment, even without renovating anything. For 1 week of cooking, notice every walk taken across the kitchen that wasn't strictly necessary. The extra trip to a pantry on the far wall. The reach across the room for something that could just as easily live closer to where it's actually used. Most kitchens can be meaningfully improved just by moving the few most used items closer together, without changing a single wall. This is really the thread running underneath every single item on this list. It was never truly about spice racks, or mugs, or fryers, or square footage on their own. It's about a kitchen designed around what actually gets used, arranged to make that use as effortless as possible, rather than one built to look impressive, and then quietly worked around day after day because the impressive version was never really designed for the way anyone actually cooks in it. 15 things. Not because Japanese kitchens are running on some extreme, joyless minimalism, but because every one of these, in its own way, is the same lesson wearing a different shape. Something that isn't earning its place is quietly costing you space, time, and a little bit of daily attention, whether or not you've ever consciously noticed the bill. None of this needs to happen all at once. Pick one thing from this list, the drawer, the spice rack, the mugs nobody drinks from, and clear just that one thing this week. Notice what the kitchen feels like with even that small amount of space given back. If it made a difference, there are 14 more waiting whenever you're ready for them. Tell me in the comments which one of these is sitting in your kitchen right now, unused, taking up space anyway. It's worth being honest, too, about which of these 15 tend to be the hardest to actually act on versus the ones that just sound hard. The junk drawer, the mismatched mugs, the crowded counter, these usually take 20 minutes and produce an immediate visible difference. The bigger ones, the refrigerator, the kitchen layout itself, aren't something to act on this week, and they don't need to be. Awareness of them is enough for now. The next time a kitchen gets renovated or a fridge gets replaced, this is the version of the decision that actually gets made differently. None of this is really about owning fewer things for the sake of a number. It's about a kitchen where almost everything in it is something that gets picked up, used, and put away on a regular basis, rather than one where half of what's technically owned is just quietly waiting, unused, for a version of daily life that never quite arrived. That's really the difference this entire list points back to. Not less for the sake of less. Just a kitchen that reflects the life actually being lived in it, instead of the one that was imagined at the moment each of these 15 things got bought. Subscribe. Every Wednesday and Saturday, this channel goes deeper into what Japan figured out about living well. See you next week.